Okay, class. So we will start talking about lymphocytes one more time. There are three main types of lymphocytes as I have drawn out here. There are T lymphocytes, also called T cells. There are B lymphocytes, also called B cells. And then some other type of lymphocytes are called natural killer cells. They go by NK cells. Two types of T lymphocytes. We have helper T lymphocytes and cytotoxic T lymphocyte. Cytotoxic T lymphocyte. There are two types of B lymphocytes that we will talk about. We have plasma cells, and then we will talk about memory cells. Okay, let's take one at a time. So let's focus on T lymphocytes first. Few things to remember. The T lymphocytes, they are the most abundant type of lymphocytes. About 70 to 85% of the lymphocytes are actually T lymphocytes. Now we will start by talking about the helper T lymphocytes first. Now the helper T lymphocytes, they obviously play a role in defense against antigen. Now these cells, helper T cells, have a specific receptor on the surface, and these receptors are called CD4 co-receptors. These are called CD4 co-receptor, and that is why helper T cells are also called CD4 cells. Okay. Alright, now remember one thing. These helper T lymphocytes, they work against very specific antigens. So for example, let's say there is this one specific antigen. I'm drawing an antigen here. And there will be a particular helper T lymphocyte that will work against this specific antigen. And then let's say this is another antigen. And there will be another type of helper T lymphocyte working against the second antigen. So there is some specificity when it comes to the antigen recognition. Okay, the helper T lymphocytes, they also present these antigens to other lymphatic cells. So they work as antigen presenting cells. Antigen presenting cells. So the helper T lymphocytes, as I mentioned before, they find some foreign material, they grab it, they don't kill it. They just take it to other immune cells and present it to other immune cells, asking them, telling them, do what you want to do. I found this. These helper T lymphocytes, what they can do is, they can secrete signaling molecules called cytokines. So I'm drawing cytokines here. So they secrete cytokines that actually bind to receptors of other lymphatic cells and activate them. So the cytokines help in activation of other lymphatic cells. All right. That's all about helper T lymphocyte. Moving on to cytotoxic T lymphocyte. Let's take a look. So the cytotoxic T lymphocyte, they have another type of receptors on the surface. And these are called CD8 receptors. CD8 co-receptor. And that's why cytotoxic T lymphocytes are also called CD8 cells. Now, the cytotoxic T cells, they can directly kill foreign cells. They can directly kill foreign cells. So let's say they can directly kill foreign cells. Hope you can understand my handwriting. They are also, like the helper T cells, they are also very, very specific against certain types of antigens. And in the upcoming slides, we will see how these cytotoxic T cells actually trigger the process of cell death. And remember, the cytotoxic T cells, they get activated by the helper T cells. So the helper T cells actually activate the cytotoxic T cells. Alright, moving on to B lymphocytes. We should change color now. Okay. The B lymphocytes make up about 15 to 30% of the total lymphocytes. They are also very, very specific in actions, and they produce antibodies. So they are specific and they produce antibodies. I want you to know this. Now there are different types of antibodies produced: IgG, IgA, IgM. Don't worry about those right now. More to be discussed in physiology. And the B lymphocytes, they actually form antigen-antibody complex. Okay, so the B lymphocytes, they form antigen-antibody complex. All right. Another thing, the B lymphocytes, they are also activated by the helper T cells. So what do we learn here? The helper T cells activate cytotoxic T lymphocytes, as shown by the green arrow. The helper T cells also activate the B lymphocytes, as shown by the blue arrow. Okay, so once activated, the B lymphocytes can form either plasma cells or memory cells. The plasma cells, they secrete antibodies. The memory cells, or the memory B lymphocytes, they actually remember the initial antigen attack. So these cells remember initial antigen attack and form more effective immune response if the same antigen strike again. So they remember the initial antigen attack and form effective response for the second time. So if the same antigen attacks us another time, we have these memory cells already built up in our system. So these memory cells will fight off that antigen even before we fall sick. Looking at NK cells, they have CD6 core receptors. So they are also called, actually I should change color. What color? Let me try light yellow. Okay, so they are called CD6 cells. Now the NK cells, they are very, very non-specific in action. So they are not specific, they are non-specific in action. And they can actually fight against a wide variety of cells. They can fight against a wide variety of cells, including some cancer cells as well. Okay, so to review, 3 types of lymphocytes: T cells, B cells, and NK cells. T cells are the most abundant ones. They form 70 to 85% of the lymphocytes. Then B cells, they are only 15 to 30% of the lymphocytes. The T cells are of 2 types, helper T cells and cytotoxic T cells. Helper T cells are also called CD4 cells. They are very specific against a particular antigen. The helper T cells are also called APC cells, or antigen presenting cells. And the helper T cells secrete cytokines that activate other lymphatic cells. Moving on to the cytotoxic T cells. The cytotoxic T cells are actually activated by the helper T cells. The cytotoxic T cells are called CD8 cells. and they can directly kill a foreign cell or any other infected cells. The cytotoxic T lymphocytes or the cytotoxic cells are also very, very specific against a particular antigen. Moving on to the B lymphocytes. B lymphocytes actually make the antigen-antibody complex, and they are very, very specific against specific antigens. The B lymphocytes actually form antibodies. Once activated by the helper T lymphocytes, the B lymphocytes can form either plasma cells or memory cells. Plasma cells particularly secrete antibodies, and the memory cells they float around in circulation. And if our body gets infected by the antigen for a second time, these memory cells are ready to fight off that infection even before we can get sick. The natural killer cells are also called CD6 cells. Remember, they work against a wide variety of cells. They are very, very non-specific in action, and they can also fight against some cancer cells. All right. So let's take a look at the PowerPoint super quick. T lymphocytes, largest population of lymphocytes, very specific in action. Two types, helper T and cytotoxic T. Now, how does the helper T lymphocytes work? Let's take a look. In the diagram here, on the left hand side, you do see a helper T lymphocyte. Do you see that? This is a helper T lymphocyte with CD4 core receptors. Now, this helper T lymphocyte finds a foreign cell with antigen on top here. So this is a foreign cell. As soon as a helper T lymphocyte finds a foreign cell, it does two things. First, it releases lots of cytokines as shown by the pink balls. And also the helper T lymphocytes start dividing by mitosis. So the two things work together. Mitotic division of the helper T cells, and also the helper T cells produce a huge amount of cytokine. These cytokines then stimulate the B lymphocytes to produce antibodies, regulate cytotoxic T lymphocytes to actually kill the antigen, and also it encourages formation of more macrophages. Why do you think we need more macrophages at this time? Well, there will be fighting, right, between the antigen and the antibodies. So there will be this huge war, right, against the foreign cell. And then there will be deaths, there will be cell debris, there will be other waste things floating around. So obviously we need the cleaning crew. We need the macrophages to come and clean up the mess. That's why more macrophages are formed. Now the question is, how does the helper T cell, how does the cytotoxic T cells work? Here is an example. So here we do see an infected cell on the left hand side, and we have a cytotoxic T cell. Now within the cytotoxic T cell, we do see some red molecules, and those are called perforin molecules. First, the cytotoxic T cell grabs the infected cell, and eventually it makes hole on the infected cell, and it transfers these perforin molecules into the infected cell. So in the second panel, we see transfer of the perforin molecules into the infected cells. The perforin molecules weakens the infected cell and causes the infected cell to burst open or lyse. Therefore, we will have death of the infected cell, and that is how the cytotoxic T lymphocyte work. I'll stop